What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 12 of Working Through the Gospel of Mark in a socio-historical and cultural context to try to bring it to life and situate Jesus and the words that he spoke as recorded by Mark in their original context as close as possible with the information that we have today. So, the ending of Mark is a very controversial topic. Now, depending on the Bible translation that you use, you might see a bracketed set of texts from verses 9 to 20 in there. And there might be some kind of a footnote saying that this is a later ending. And there is not really a lot of, in my opinion, conclusive enough evidence to say one is better than the other. I happen to ascribe that the end of Mark, personally, is the longer ending of Mark, verses 9 through 20, I don't have a problem with them. I've seen some validity in those, and I think they're also situated very apocalyptically, and they fit the story well. However, I will say that there is a clear break in the narration. There's like a clear shift from verses 8 and 9. And so I'm going to kind of work through that a little bit here and bring a little bit of perspective, and I hope it helps. So Mark's gospel obviously ends abruptly in verse 16:8 with these women that arrive at the tomb. And a young man in white tells them that this Yeshua, this Jesus, is risen and is going ahead of them to the Galilee. And then they run away trembling and say nothing. And then it's a stop. But this is Mark's genius in storytelling. There's no resurrection appearances. There's no triumphal proclamation. Just fear, silence, and an open road in front of them. And this actually has bothered people for a really long time. And so there's a theory out there in the academy that this is why people later than the apostles added the longer ending to Mark. And which is understood to provide the closure to Mark that Mark, the author of Mark, actually purposely withholds. But once we read it within its proper Jewish context, the ending is not really a problem to be solved. It's actually the thrust of what Mark is trying to lead us through as a reader. So in Second Temple Jewish literature, remember what we've been talking about? So we have the Hebrew Bible, which it all builds off of. We have the Pseudepigrapha, which is where we get books like Enoch and Baruch, the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. Then we have the Apocrypha, where we have the Maccabee stories, 4th Ezra. We have the longer ending of Daniel. We have Tobit. We have Judith, and some of those kind of books. So these sets of texts that arguably most of, or maybe even all of, the Second Temple first century Jews knew of, fear and trembling are the standard and actually appropriate expected human responses, especially people that are reverent towards Yahweh, to encountering divine beings, whether they're angels or they're the divine presence of God itself. Like we see that a little bit more in the Hebrew Bible. Isaiah, for example, falls apart. He's undone. Woe is me, a man of unclean lips. I am undone in the presence of God. When he finds himself there, Ezekiel, the prophet, collapses face down, or Daniel, when he encounters these grandiose divine apocalyptic visions, like he's overwhelmed and can't even eat. He's forced to the ground. Same thing in the book of Revelation, where John the Apostle, who we believe wrote it, in the first chapter, just falls on his face as if dead. So apocalyptic literature of the period describes the same response quite frequently, actually, when we have kind of the breaking in of something from the heavens to the earth. Typically produces not a tranquility, but something that's pretty destabilizing and pretty awesome. All right, so the women at the end of Mark trembling in silence at the tomb isn't a picture of cowardice or even faithlessness. It's actually a pretty good caricature in response to something utterly beyond human comprehension. Like, this is totally enamoring to them. This guy that they love so much, that they believed to be Israel's king, his redeemer, his this guy that's going to make all the promises of God come to pass. He gets crucified by the Romans, by their enemies, and it's like this is the exact opposite expectation that they have. So at the end of the Sabbath, or the beginning of the first day of the week, when they go, the tomb is already empty, and they see this encounter, and it freaks them out. And to be honest with you, I would be freaked out too. So which is pretty cool. But so um, it's God's kind of inbreaking his power in breaking into reality that affirms or confirms the prophetic oracles, where death even itself would somehow be swallowed up. And we can take this all the way back really to Genesis 3. It's also a verification and a proof that Jesus is the long-awaited Messianic King of Israel. So this silence connects something that Mark has actually been doing through the whole gospel story, actually. So from the beginning, Jesus is repeatedly telling people to tell no one what they've seen or what they've experienced. What scholars will call the messianic secret, which is kind of bizarre. It's like, okay, if you want people to know who you are and people to believe in you, why wouldn't you just tell them and do all these things? But this is not the way divine revelation works. There's a precedent, and he's operating fully and squarely within that precedence in the time period. Mark has, through his gospel, when we get to the end, has trained his audience, and we'll work through this as we go through this verse by verse, to recognize that God's decisive action in the world doesn't really always announce itself loudly or compel immediate recognition. Think about the story of Messiah now. Like, he wants to save his people, the Jewish people, right? Those aren't all of his people, but those are what we would call older brother, right? God is interested in them. God is interested in Muslims too. He's interested in everybody. And the way he operates and the way he does what he does is puzzling to people. It's like, okay, like if he wants to do this, why doesn't he just reveal himself loudly and openly? Well, that's just not the way he works. And I think there's, that's a complicated question, actually. That's a really sophisticated question that has sparked debate for millennia. And that debate's probably not going to stop until Christ comes back. But we do have precedents for this, and it's the way that God has chosen to bring revelation to his people. And I think it works off of kind of the apocalyptic tradition, where really when people are ready and actually interested and they're going to respond correctly, like, is when God really reveals himself. At least that's kind of how my story was, actually. So Mark has trained his audience to recognize that God's action don't always announce itself loudly or compel recognition. And a lot of the times it moves, the revelation of God moves quietly, kind of beneath the surface, until the moment of full disclosure. And the prophets talk about this. The day of Yahweh, the day of judgment, the day of Christ Jesus, the return of Christ, the establishment of God's kingdom, when every eye will see and every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. At that time, there's no denying it. But until that time comes, we've got to persevere and execute the mission that he's given us to walk in. So the silence at the tomb is really a climactic and culminating expression of that very theme. Okay? So what's interesting is that Mark's ending is kind of remarkable. He's a brilliant storyteller, and it doesn't close the story. It actually opens the door and pushes us, because Mark, we know what Mark believes. He believes that this Yeshua, this Jesus, is the Messianic King, right? And he's not telling us you have to believe. He's laying out evidence very compellingly in his mind, and he's obviously trying to inspire those who would read his story to lead us through his story, to push us through his story, to make our own decision. So the young man at the tomb says that Yeshua, Jesus, is going ahead of them to the Galilee, back to where the entire story began. The audience, which is us, anybody who chooses to read it, Mark ends the way that he does because the entire gospel has been building toward a decision that no character within the narrative can make for the reader. Okay? So the empty tomb has been declared. The risen Yeshua, the risen messianic figure, is going ahead of them, and the question is left hanging in the air. The question that Mark has been pressing toward from the very first word. Will the reader respond with a hardened heart that has characterized as been stereotypical of Israel's consistent and persistent covenant failure and rejection of God throughout its history, or with an open, costly, all in allegiance response that genuine, true Christ-following discipleship actually demands? Mark does not tell you what to do with Jesus. He just tells you the story with facts that I believe are historically true. And I'm sure if you're watching this, you probably do too. He just shows you the empty tomb and waits and gives you all that you need to make a decision based on faith and to respond accordingly in light of the apocalyptic imminent hope that we have when God comes to make all things new and right all the wrongs in history and establish his kingdom. Hope this has been a blessing, guys. We're almost done. We have one more intro video, and then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes and start to rock and roll. God bless y'all. Have a good day.